There are many important scientific reasons to study climate change and to use phenology data to better understand how it will affect plants and ecosystems. I am Paul Alabak, a scientist with Project BudBurst. In this video, we will talk more about the practical applications of using Project BudBurst data to understand and prepare for climate change. One of the most important uses of phenology data is in determining which species will adapt successfully to climate change. Project BudBurst data provides detailed records about how individual species and sometimes individual plants change their phenology over time and in response to changes in weather and climate. From studies of the long historical record of Concord, Massachusetts, started by Henry David Thoreau, we've learned that some species can change their phenology rapidly in response to changes in weather and climate, and these tend to become more resilient to the effects of climate change. Other species send out leaves or flowers at the same time of year, regardless of changes in weather and climate. The inability of these species to change their phenology when the climate changes was found to be a good predictor of which species decline in abundance over time, and presumably which species will be most sensitive to the effects of climate change. This leads to one of the most important applications of Project BudBurst data. Rather than just being one set of data about one place, Project BudBurst citizen scientists are submitting data which can be used to understand patterns of change from individual observers, counties, states, regions, or across the whole country. For example, in this figure, we see how broadly distributed Project BudBurst observations were for the spring of 2012. You cannot just average all of our observations across the country to understand the effects of climate change, because not all parts of the country are going to respond in the same way to it. This diversity in responses to climate change is because of the climatic diversity of the country, and because the rates and directions of change are expected to vary depending on the region and the effects of mountains, oceans, and mixing of air masses in different parts of the country. It will be essential that scientists understand how the effects of climate change will vary by region and the best way to define these regions. In this figure, the National Ecological Observatory Network, NEON, developed a classification for the climatic and ecological features of the country so as to develop a scientific basis for identifying where sensors are needed to monitor environmental change across the country. This is also a good way to compare Project BudBurst phenological data across the country, since all of the observations within any one of these regions should have similar overall climatic characteristics. In dry regions, such as grasslands and deserts in the west, we would expect plant phenology to change not only as a consequence of an increase in average winter temperatures, but also in close association with changes in the incidence of drought and rainstorms. In these regions, plants often put out new leaves or flowers following significant rainfall. Recent patterns of drought and land use change have resulted in many significant ecological changes to these regions. In the high mountains of Colorado, by contrast, a big factor will be how changes in climate will affect the average depth of snow and timing of snowmelt in the spring or early summer. Already, scientists have seen that snow is melting earlier, and as a consequence, plants are emerging earlier in the spring. But some of these plants are actually producing fewer flowers and seeds because they are now much more susceptible to frost damage. Another interesting example is the southeastern part of the country. In this region, they have had such warm winters recently that many plants no longer stay dormant long enough to respond appropriately to warming weather in the spring. This can result in plants actually leafing out or flowering later in the year. Fruit trees are particularly sensitive to this loss of winter chilling. Another aspect of environmental change that can be monitored with phenology data from Project BudBurst is the effects of urbanization on local climates. As more concrete in buildings replace natural vegetation, the local climate warms up. Recent studies have used phenology data across rural, suburban, and urban habitats to see how this is changing over time. Phenological data collected at a national scale, such as from Project BudBurst, should provide a solid foundation for developing more accurate predictions of how climate change will affect individual species and whole ecosystems or particular regions. What remains to be developed is a better framework for showing how these changes will affect individual regions. This will require improvements in the resolution of climatic models, as well as more complete understanding of how these changes in climate can affect particular species or regions. In this figure, changes in species distributions are predicted to change, assuming that species have the same association with climate today that they will have in the future. With phenology data, we can make more realistic assumptions, since we will have information on the ability of individual species to adapt to changes in climate. So what can we learn by studying phenology and being a Project BudBurst volunteer? In a word, lots. Not only will you become more aware of the natural world and better appreciate the outdoor environment where you live, but you can play a big part in contributing to the science of phenology. With the thousands of citizen scientists that participate in Project BudBurst every year, we are documenting how plants are changing their phenology across the country as the environment changes. Project BudBurst will be contributing to one of the most important environmental issues facing the country in the coming decades. Thanks for listening. To learn more about why Project BudBurst is important to science, please view the other videos in our